Welcome, everyone, to the Implications of Executive Orders on Climate Disaster Response in Frontline Communities webinar. My name is Taylor Ward, she, her, and I am the Senior Manager of Communications and Education at Just Solutions. I am calling in from Yakutsk Land, also known as Fresno, California. Just Solutions acknowledges that we occupy the stolen land of Turtle Island, home to countless Native tribes and nations. We recognize the ongoing struggles and violence Indigenous communities face and honor Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and activism. We are committed to supporting justice for Indigenous communities in our work by reflecting this in all that we do. You can check out native-land.ca to find out whose land you're on and find more resources that support Native advocacy in your area. For those who don't know, Just Solutions is a national organization that drives innovative, equitable solutions to the climate crisis in support of healthy, resilient communities and accountable democratic institutions. We ground our work in the broader movement for environmental justice and the guiding principle that frontline communities most harmed by climate change should lead in creating and implementing solutions. If you're joining us, please feel free to add your name, your organization, and where you're located in the chat so everyone else can know who else is on the call with us today. And now to introduce our speakers. Today, we will hear from Amanda DeVecca-Renier, Executive Director at New Jersey Resource Project and New Jersey Organizing Project. Amanda brings over 20 years of experience in community organizing and strategic leadership. Formed after Superstorm Sandy in 2014, New Jersey Resource Project and Organizing Project have redirected hundreds of millions of dollars in disaster aid to keep working families in their homes and continue to shift our broken disaster recovery system to ensure full and fair disaster recovery. We'll also hear from Angelica Salas, Executive Director at Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, or CHIRLA. In her role, she has transformed CHIRLA into a mass membership immigrant-led organization that empowers immigrants and their families to win local, state, and national policies that advance their human, civil, and labor rights. CHIRLA is one of the nation's largest and most effective immigrants' rights organizations that organizes, advocates, educates, and provides legal services to all immigrants. We'll also hear from Sarah Labowitz, non-resident scholar of Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Sarah researches and writes about disasters at both looming shocks and windows for adaptation. She publishes the Disaster Dollar Database, which tracks spending on disaster recovery in the United States. And to introduce Sylvia Chi, Sylvia is the Legal and Advocacy Director at Just Solutions. Her role is to further policy innovation, foster peer learning, and help to build greater capacity for BIPOC frontline groups. She is an attorney and a climate justice policy expert based in Oakland. And now I will turn it over to Rich Stolz, who is a senior fellow at Just Solutions and the Democracy Fund and focuses on the intersection of climate justice and immigrants' rights strategy and organizing.
Thank you, Taylor. Really appreciate you and Just Solutions. And I am just in love with this panel of speakers who are doing incredibly important work across the country. And I think can really help make sense of everything happening in DC under the Trump administration and what it means for our communities across the country. And both in terms of the current onslaught of executive actions, but also in terms of how communities can be responding and preparing in their own right. So among the range of things that have been happening across the federal government, at a time when climate disasters are impacting American communities at an unprecedented rate, President Trump has floated the idea of reforming or entirely ending the Federal Emergency Management Administration. This proposal is potentially dangerous and certainly misguided. And there have been a range of announcements, ranging from the creation of a council that would review disaster response strategy. The executive order describing that council, in fact, included accusations that were unfounded against FEMA, which raises concerns about the preordained outcome of such a council. There have been other efforts under the so-called Department of Government Efficiency um, to lay off large numbers of workers based on the relationship to DEI initiatives within FEMA. There are a range of action taking place across government and within FEMA itself, um, raising important concerns or questions about the capacity of the federal government to even respond to emergency response in local communities. And this is all happening despite the fact that there have been robust and amazing campaigns to try to improve FEMA. I wanted to make clear that this conversation is about understanding what is happening federally and what the implications may be for local communities. But it's also important to understand that there have been efforts to improve FEMA's relationship with communities and to improve its policies all along. And we run the risk of the debate sidestepping the very real needs of people impacted by disasters and going straight to an entirely different conversation. Given that, I wanted to take a moment to just express my gratitude and appreciation to the various leaders represented on this call who have extensive experience in organizing in communities, organizing people impacted by natural disasters, who've done research and analysis of FEMA and its activities over the years, and would have important insights for the broader community on how to prepare um, for disasters that may be happening in your own communities in response to um, this particular moment in the Trump administration. And and I'm really looking forward to the question and answer portion of this conversation, where we might be able to think a little bit about what the movement might do in response. So let me first turn to Amanda. In your role at the New Jersey Organizing Project and Resource Project, as well as your role with Organizing Resilience, which is a national collective of organizations. I'd love to hear a little bit about the work that you've done um, in organizing people impacted by natural disasters, some of the important victories over the last year, and um, what the implications of the Trump administration may be for those particular victories, and how you're thinking about this moment, given the impact that the organizing of your peers have had.
Um, Hi everyone. Thank you for those very thoughtful questions, Rich, and for getting us all in conversation. Um, I just want to double check because I love to time myself when I'm timed. I have 10 minutes to respond to that, right? No more? Okay. So I am from a very, very white working class community in southern New Jersey. And time is like one of those things that we're a little obsessed with in my culture. That is part of why I'm here with y'all today, and I'm going to start there. My community was absolutely devastated by Superstorm Sandy, and folks that are in New Jersey or outside of New Jersey might think of the New Jersey Shore as the MTV show. I will say this until the end of days. Those folks were from Staten Island. And they might think of it as like a place where there are a lot of wealthy people. There are many, 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 many poor and working class folks that surround the places that were impacted by Sandy. And I went from being a national campaign director with People's Action to starting an organization from scratch, like literally on the small island that I'm from, 2 years after Superstorm Sandy, because I was watching the absolute devastation of not the storm, but the disaster recovery system that was failing regular people, Black, white, folks with language barriers, basically like anybody who was not wealthy was really struggling. And so I've spent 10 years sort of unexpectedly organizing disaster survivors and organizing in the disaster recovery space. And it's been the most rewarding work I've done as a community organizer. And I'm incredibly grateful for sort of like the teaming up of folks like myself who have been organizing in, with, and through disasters and disaster prone areas, that is organizing resilience. And I'll talk about that a little bit. Um, and and I think, part of the reality is there were places that were kind of hit frequently by disaster that you could kind of count on to be places where we'd see disaster. And then Now it just seems like that could be anyone, anywhere. And so the work of making sure our members, families, and communities can end up uh, okay again, on their feet again after a disaster is just more and more important. So yeah, we went from 9 members to we have almost 8,000 members. Now we have 2 disasters. We were South Jersey based and now we're statewide. And so you can really do a lot of work um, in this arena, both to build power and deliver real results for communities on the front lines. So I'm going to just share my screen and talk a little bit about organizing resilience. So can everybody see that? Can folks give me a thumbs up if you, yes, thank you. I'm not confident in my tech skills. So we believe climate disasters are a pivotal window to really show up for the people we love and live with or want to build with and fight for real solutions. Um, yeah, there we go. So here's the thing. Power shifts during moments of climate disaster. They are huge drivers of political, economic, and cultural change. We can like let that drive us, or we can try to be in the driver's seat and take advantage of some of that upheaval, some of the context shifting, some of what might be available that wasn't available before. But in my experience, 100%, had we not intervened both in Sandy and Ida organizing, many working families would have ended up just completely destitute on the other side of a disaster. So we do care about climate change, but really this is about power. And there's this way in which, your question of like, what does this mean in the new Trump administration or in the new administration? I mean, I think we can kind of all agree this is a disaster that we're in right now. And so our experience organizing through disasters, I think, continues to better prepare us for whatever disaster we face in our communities or whatever the political moment is, right? Like many things are up in the air, many things are shifting. We still have to figure out whatever through lines we have to increase our power and to really deliver for our communities. Organizing resilience is really shaped by people like myself. Like I'm just the ED at New Jersey in New Jersey, and I'm the one representing organizing resilience on this panel because we want to center the people that are doing the base building work and organizing on the ground and their experience. We have a bias for action, move at the speed of trust, and it it can be a little confusing, the structure shifts sometimes with organizing resilience, but it's because we're really making an effort to keep things lean and focus on supporting people on the ground. What else do I got? So these stats I think are kind of amazing that almost all of us live in counties that experienced a climate disaster, since 2011. And I know this is, talking about climate migration in New Jersey, we're seeing right now some forced migration of communities internal in New Jersey that are low and moderate income, that they're being removed from their communities where the middle and upper class folks don't have to leave. So, we're starting to see, I mean, that's just something that's happening, but we're really seeing people having to move and be displaced even internally. Um, and, the amount of money and things and lives that are lost in these disasters. Well, here's a calculation, but in some ways it's incalculable. Our last storm here in New Jersey was Ida, and we lost 30 people in that storm, and they were largely people that were trying to drive through an intense rainstorm. This is not a coastal community or communities that usually flooded, and it dropped more rain in that short period of time than we had been used to or really ever seen, and people tried to make it home, which is an absolutely natural response. And 30 people, I think almost 26 of those people lost their lives in their cars. Um, so there's three main things we do, and we sort of see these things as a spring or as a coil. So we do rapid response. We do activation with folks right after a disaster. We try to use our shared experience navigating the federal disaster recovery system to help people navigate it in that specific disaster. They don't make it easy for us. It changes all the time. So you really have to put together a team of people to figure out, okay, how do we get a community through this? That's part of what we do in our community of practice. We sort of meet and we work on things together. And then in the spring format, when something is we're seeing this on the ground, we're seeing something bubble up, people are really talking about it. Okay, can we take this to a big fight? And so in two instances, this is a bunch of us, this is a photo of folks from Georgia actually that went to Washington, D.C. at the end of the year this year with almost 70 storm survivors from Hawaii to Georgia to Western North Carolina, New Jersey. We tagged along even though we hadn't had a recent storm to push for federal disaster recovery aid. So sometimes out of this work emerges a push that we can unify together on, and there have been two in recent times that we've been able to unify together on. And I want to sort of talk about those and talk about what we do moving forward. So us and many of our other friends who've been working on FEMA, we've won some improvements to FEMA that I think are kind of a big deal. And we have a fact sheet we can provide on those, but they just make things easier for folks that don't have. And then we did, right, again, with other friends in disaster recovery organizing space, managed to get a big chunk of money at the end of the year that is now going to be distributed to disasters from Lahaina all the way through what we saw with like Helene and Milton in the end of the year. And so far, that is still happening. It's, happening with some potential shifts and changes, but so far we still have the opportunity to draw those investments down. And so I think this is what like we know in this moment. Again, if we frame the current situation and administration we're in as a disaster, there are going to be challenges and there are going to be opportunities. So I think there are three things that I've been looking at, and we've been talking about at Organizing Resilience. We're going to have to try to defend our wins, right? We still want FEMA to fix somebody's roof, whether or not that roof had some damage or wasn't as kept up before the storm, right? That really matters. So some of the things we won in terms of changes with FEMA, we'd like to see those continue to be implemented, right? And obviously there's more we can do. We want to see that CDBG-DR money continue to move to help as many folks in our communities as we can with real investments in making people's homes livable again after a storm or better prepared for future storms, and real investments in our communities to better, again, help us withstand extreme weather. So we're going to have to defend our wins. I think this is an opportunity to continue to deepen the role that everyday people play in our movements. A lot of what we're going to need in order to understand the impact of this administration and what it's doing, we are going to have to find out directly from the folks that are living through it. And so this is a huge opportunity to kind of continue to build our base, recenter the experiences of everyday working class people and their priorities in the work and organizing that we do. That feels like a big opportunity in this moment. Last but not least, it seems like there could be some crises in the next 4 years, right? Sarah is going to talk some about this executive order about what, potentially reforming FEMA. Rich mentioned that too, but there's other crises we might see, like when the banks crashed the economy in 2008 or with COVID. And what does it mean for us to line up some potential plays that would be possible in those crises that would not otherwise be possible? Like I could imagine having something happen around home insurance, right? And so, how might we not be flat footed this time? Like, our community has had a vision to turn the National Flood Insurance Program into a National Climate Disaster Insurance Program since Sandy 10 years ago. How might we actually expand the public good, but also think about how we hold some of these corporations accountable and what we want to sort of extract from them for any concessions or aid that we're giving them? So, I think the more united we are and the more prepared we are for what might come, the better we're going to be able to get something for us out of it. And 10 minutes.
Thanks, Amanda. Um, just briefly, can you take a moment to describe what CDBG-DR is?
Sorry. Yes, I can. And I had 18 seconds left, so I'll do it in 18 seconds. Community development block grants come from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. A lot of times people think of FEMA as like the main agency that does disaster recovery, but actually like the best funding that is most useful for our families and communities long term comes out of HUD. It's Community Development Block Grant dash disaster recovery, so CDBGDR. So I said that and assumed everybody knew what I was talking about. Thank you for fixing that. It comes later. It takes a really long time. Sarah might touch on that, but it is the sort of the best kind of money we can get that really helps our families. We saw almost 8,000 working class Sandy impacted families rebuild their houses and be higher up and better prepared for future storms with that money. It made a huge difference in the future of my community. I see it every day.
Let's and there's we want to make sure there's time for Q&A, but let's take that pivot and talk about the fact that disasters are going to be hitting us. And there's a question of how do we respond in that moment. And wanted to ask Angelica to share a little bit about the experience in a recent disaster in Los Angeles. As a leader of an immigrant rights organization directly impacted by the fires, how are you organizing? How are you responding? And what are you seeing as one of the major disaster events post-Trump inauguration?
So I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much, Rich. And I really want to start first by saying thank you to Organizing Resilience for being here with us on the ground. Really appreciate it. So saw a lot of pictures of our folks and family, even on the pictures you shared. So thank you. So I wanted to share a little bit about Chirla's climate, just our experience here in Los Angeles. But before that, I want to describe a little bit more about Chirla itself. Let me know if you're able to see my screen, as it's amazing that we all do this all the time, but we always have a little trouble. So once again, my name is Angelica Salas. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights here in California. So Chirla was founded in 1986 to create a just society fully inclusive of immigrants. So we advance the human, the civil, the labor rights of immigrants and refugees. We are a mass membership organization with over 51,000 members who are immigrant youth, workers, and entire families. And so we organize regional grassroots committees and youth student committees throughout the state of California, driving campaigns to advocate for just policies at a local, state, and national level. We do provide legal services to thousands annually. We actually conduct Know Your Rights and informational community education outreach to hundreds of thousands, and also provide direct cash assistance, food assistance, humanitarian aid to immigrant families who often are left without a safety net due to their immigration status during major disasters or pandemics. Chirla is also part of the Climate Justice Department and has a Climate Justice Department and works in partnership with the National Partnership for New Americans with the Climate Justice Collaborative there. So as part of our work, we have actually engaged in other climate disasters and responded to the needs of our immigrant community during and after a disaster. An example of this was our response to the 2023 flood in Pajaro, California, that damaged over 273 homes, mostly homes of farm workers and their families. We're still there because responding to a climate disaster means actually staying on the ground for the long haul. We were there to support families, and we worked with amazing local organizations to ensure that these families were not forgotten and that we won state aid that came back to those communities, even though sometimes at the federal level they were left behind. So while we have responded in the past to many disasters, the Los Angeles climate disaster was the one that impacted many of us personally, and one that we had to respond to. I have lived in the Northwest Pasadena, Altadena area for over 50 years since I came to this country. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. The Eaton fire climate disaster impacted me, my family, and my friends directly. Today, friends and families have houses that have burned down and have joined thousands of people who are left without a home, a place of worship, a school, or lost their jobs. My sister's school where she taught was burned to the ground, and the place that my aunt worked at as in a nursing home burned to the ground. So lost their jobs, but have nieces and uncles and cousins who lost their homes at this moment. So it's very personal as we now respond. But I'm very proud of the work that Sheila has been doing on the ground, because even as we were responding to the fire itself, and I mean, living through it, we also knew that we had to respond. So Shirley's been on the ground since day one in the disaster zones, both of the Eaton and the Palisades fires, and in our community to assist individuals who are Spanish-speaking immigrant households who are impacted by these wildfires. We're learning and documenting their experience in order to ensure that they're not left alone without aid, especially if their immigration status leaves them out of some of the federal FEMA aid for which they do not qualify, or if they fear that they don't qualify, or they fear to give information because of the Trump administration's obsession with getting information about undocumented people for the purposes of deportation. As the fires raged, and as you can see here with what I'm sharing, this is what's left of many of our communities. It's estimated that over 200,000 people were under evacuation orders. So as the fires raged, we actually had a major immigration raid happening simultaneously in Bakersfield, California, where Border Patrol and ICE were conducting large immigration raids that resulted in over 100 people being detained, with many deported immediately after their communities and families. Now, before the Trump administration, there was internal policy that said that during a storm, during a wildfire, during any kind of natural disaster, there would be no immigration enforcement. What the Trump administration has done is completely ignored this policy and actually moved on enforcement on the ground, even as we're trying to recuperate from these fires, both in Los Angeles and in other parts of California. Today, but for us, we have to persevere. That's who we are. And so it's important for me to also just share with you some of the work that we did during that time. First, we wanted to affirm, even in this toxic and impacted environment, that we wanted to make sure that our community knew that in the state of California, it didn't matter what your immigration status was, that any of the shelters were actually were there for people, and that we understood that people were fearful, but it was important for us to go on social media, go on the radio, and tell everybody that their immigration status did not matter, that they should seek shelter. And I think this is very important as we think about what it means to respond, and especially as we have more and more of these climate disasters. We also wanted to make sure that we understood that a climate disaster of this type, while it was the Eaton Fire and the Palisades Fire, all of Los Angeles was completely, it was the air was toxic. So we made sure that we were able to get a donation of over 400,000 K95 masks from a small business in Seattle, Washington, that then came down to Los Angeles. And so we were able to distribute over 370,000 masks to organizations and workplaces, and directly to homes of people who were impacted. And so we've been receiving donations since that time. We also were able to get donations in the form of food vouchers for our families. And so we've been in the field since day one, supporting our community. We're partnering with some of our local elected officials, making sure that our communities actually have what they need in this time, and that they feel heard. And so to this moment, we've actually have over 746 applications for disaster relief. This also includes cash assistance, food assistance, and of course, we're getting the information that is necessary for our community. I wanted to share just in the voices of our community as we finish with time, because I really want to make sure that you hear directly from those that we are supporting. And I hope that this is going to work for you in terms of sound. So I think it's always important to hear directly from the individuals impacted by these fires. The last thing that I wanted to say is that um, of all the families that we've supported in the households, these applications of the families that we've supported, it actually adds up to over 3,000 individuals who benefited from this assistance. And you saw us in the field. I also want to just bring up that 72% of them did not qualify for FEMA or any other kind of federal assistance because of their immigration status. For many of them, we were the first and only source of aid during the fires. But our task is also to get people connected to all the other resources that are available. We're working with these families to ensure that our local and state aid is available to anyone irrespective of status. And many of the individuals have had trouble getting aid because of language access to services. And so for the federal government to do away with any level of language access through FEMA services, any kind of emergency assistance will leave millions of people who left without protection or even understanding. Many of these individuals did not understand the evacuation notices. Many others did not even receive them. So thank you so much for giving me this time, and thank you for putting attention to this very important aspect of the work of Chirla in partnership with so many other organizations on the ground to make sure our communities get organized and work together for the long haul, and we're able to rebuild, but really rebuild with equity and justice.
Thank you, Angelica. And I think there were some problems with the audio, but I think if we can make sure we can make that video available to folks afterward, I think that would be great. Um, but, yeah. So, Angelica, just out of kind of curiosity, I've heard news reports about how Trump and other folks have, thrown out the idea, and I think it's technically not a legal thing or something they could even really do, but conditioning like disaster relief on things that California might do, like voter ID law changes, or removing regulations on on ocean protection in California, and then you know, and then some of the other guidances that were received and reported on, where FEMA agents were actually required to use the language of ICE in their interactions with people who may be undocumented. So, like, what was your sense of that, and what California's response has been, and how are you watching that, reviewing those situations?
Well, I think first and foremost, we're working to make sure that our local and state government stands courageous, and they stand, really embody the courage that our people have. And so that they ensure that many of those attacks on our community, or that unwillingness, or even I would say adversarial and almost from a place of persecution to our people, that there is a buffer of care locally and statewide, and that they stand against many of these policies. But it has a real impact, and I feel like I really need to say this, that and I was in the field working with many with my team as we were taking in some of those applications, and people would ask the question, tell me, is any of this information going to be used against me? Tell me, is this safe? Is this safe for me to access? And so it really leaves in this moment that is so traumatic, extremely traumatic. It leaves people even more vulnerable. And then I also think that it was so shameful that there were conversations about withholding any level of disaster aid, and due to, if we give you the disaster aid, therefore you then have to diminish any of the sanctuary protections at the local or state level. And so far, our local and state officials have withstood that. But I just really want you to remember that before the Trump administration came in, Secretary Mayorkas, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, who oversaw FEMA, actually on September 8th sent out a notice saying no activity, we should not have any kind of immigration enforcement activity during this time. Everybody should be protected. Everybody should feel safe and comfortable. And that is so far from where the Trump administration is right now, and instead creating more vulnerability, both obviously on the immigration side, but also on the environmental protection side. And the reason we have responded so many times is because when these disasters hit, whether it's workers, homeowners, or renters are left vulnerable. And so many people after these disasters, those who I would say are the most vulnerable are also the individuals with the least amount of assets or resources to actually withstand the disaster.
I wanted to turn to Sarah next. And Sarah, just given your background and the research you've done, your experience, you know, after having heard from Amanda and Helica, and seeing everything sort of being announced and things happening at FEMA, how do you make sense of this moment, and what are the implications for organizations and local governments in this moment?
Thanks so much, Rich, and Angelica, Amanda. It's great to be with you. I work at an organization in Washington. It's a think tank called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But I live in Houston, and I worked for the local government here after Hurricane Harvey. And I lived through Harvey, was at the George R. Brown Convention Center. We had 10,000 people sheltering there in 2017. And then I worked for the city for 2 years, really fighting over Amanda mentioned earlier, this HUD money, which is the long-term housing recovery money. And that was the money that allowed us to build 4,000 new units of affordable housing in Houston after Harvey in a relatively short amount of time. And it sparked for me this kind of question that I couldn't let go of like, where is all this money? How do you anticipate it? How do you maximize the money that is available? Because it's not all, Angelica, just listening to you talk about the limitations of the FEMA money, it's both heaven and hell, right? Like, we need the FEMA money. The FEMA money needs to serve the community. And also so many people are excluded from that. So there's the often very painful process of applying for money in this kind of back and forth for individual households. But there's all this other money that's kind of invisible. And that's what I've really focused on in the last few years, is how do you make all this other money that flows into communities after disaster, how do you make that visible in a way that people could access it, could shape it, could have influence over where it's spent? And there's really two kinds of money that I'm interested in at this level. One is the FEMA Public Assistance Program. So, Angelica, you talked about how your sister's school burned in the fire. This is a program where FEMA reimburses local jurisdictions for the cost of doing things like rebuilding schools. So it's things that benefit the whole community as opposed to one individual household. And that's just a huge amount of money that historically has flowed into different communities around the country after disaster. And the second pot of money that I'm really interested in is this like acronym city that Amanda mentioned, the CDBG-DR money, Community Development Block Grant for Disaster Recovery money. And that's special money that's appropriated from Congress to do things like rebuild affordable housing. And it's the only money that's designated for primarily to be used in low and moderate income communities and for low and moderate income households. So those are just huge pots of money that are very difficult to see. And I published something called the Disaster Dollar Database, which allows you to look up how much money has gone where for a particular storm in your community. And I'll put the link to that in the chat as soon as I make sure I have the right link pulled up. But Rich, to your question of like, how do I understand this moment? So today is a really interesting day to be doing this because President Trump signed an executive order that was issued today on disaster recovery. And for the last few weeks, we've been anticipating that this order was going to come down. And at the beginning of the month, Secretary Noem was making very strident statements that she wanted to get rid of FEMA as it exists today. And it's like hard to defend FEMA as an agency politically, and there are all kinds of problems and all this stuff. So But I will say that getting rid of FEMA 90 days before storm season would have been an absolute unmitigated disaster for so many communities, not just because of the individual money that goes to households, but the money that FEMA reimburses to jurisdictions to like clean up debris and rebuild schools. So you got to get kids back to school, you got to get people back to work after a disaster. So to pull FEMA back from that would have been horrific. And what we saw over the course of the last few weeks is that Republican members of Congress have started to speak out to say, there are problems at FEMA. We would like to reform those problems. Do not get rid of FEMA as it exists today. And what we saw in the executive order that was released this morning is something that's really different than what we've seen at USAID or EPA, where they really are remaking the entire federal bureaucracy. They've issued what would be a much more typical EO in another kind of administration, where they're going to do a 90-day review of the resilience plan, a 240-day review of the different kinds of policies that inform disaster recovery. And so I got a call this morning from a reporter that was basically like, well, this is a nothing burger, like this order is sort of meaningless. And I was like, what an enormous victory if you care about preserving our ability to recover this storm season. And so I think we're in this really interesting moment where I do think today this this executive order opens, it keeps the door open that we need to stay open. And then we still have the process of how do we influence the reforms and what are the possibilities for real reform that many people who have been working on FEMA want. And so I think this next 240 days, this next few months is going to be a really interesting and important time.
Thank you, Sarah. And then how does that executive order jive with some of the anticipated layoffs and other things happening at FEMA? Because I think there are questions about across the government about just the government's ability to deliver on expectations in this moment, and like how do those things jive with each other?
Yeah. So preserving the policy space doesn't matter that much if there's been enough brain drain at FEMA where its capacity to respond is greatly reduced. There was already an employee shortage, a workforce shortage at FEMA before. It's not even, the dynamic at FEMA has been that they laid off, or they fired 4 of the most senior officials about 6 weeks ago. And I think morale is really low and hiring is really slow. We've not seen yet sort of massive layoffs. We've seen like lots of people, so there's still lots of vacancies at FEMA and just sort of a brain drain of people leaving. So we're not out of the woods, to be clear.
Thank you. And as we shift into Q&A, I wanted to invite Sylvia just to provide a little bit of context. Recently, Just Solutions issued a report looking at Project 2025 and implementation of a number of ideas under the Trump administration. How would you put what's happening at FEMA in the context of, and some of this is addressed in the report, but in the context of what's happening to environmental justice more broadly in the Trump administration?
Well, there's a lot there. I think the first thing is just to keep in mind that the Trump administration is lumping in environmental justice with their attack on DEI. We're starting to see a lot of actions from various agencies where they're saying, take out these equity provisions, these environmental justice programs. And that's just part of their, broader like ideological attack on what they perceive as something that is, woke and terrible. So they're sweeping in like environmental justice as part of that. In terms of FEMA, it's, the politics of that are a little bit different, as Sarah was just talking about. Like the obviously disasters don't discriminate based on whether, the state is governed by Republicans or Democrats. So Republicans uh, in Congress and like governors recognize that they need support from the federal government. So there's a little bit more opportunity there to push back against some of the destruction that the Trump Musk regime is wreaking at the federal level. So I think that's actually somewhat of a bright spot in the desolate, landscape that we're all experiencing right now. That said, it is definitely true that it was the plan set in Project 2025 to make a lot of changes that would be very destructive if they are carried out. So, like part of what they proposed was shifting a lot of the disaster recovery costs to states by capping the federal cost share, and states can't can't create money like the federal government can. States have, they have limited budgets. They just can't provide the same kind of disaster recovery resources as the federal government can. So that could be potentially disastrous, especially when you combine it with all of the other cuts that are happening illegally through DOGE, especially at HUD as well as FEMA, and in addition to all the safety net cuts that are being threatened through the regular budget process too. So it's just going to be it's a tsunami of like crises that is potentially coming down the pike from the federal government, and states are really going to be in a difficult situation if some of these things come to pass. Some other things that that Project 2025 proposed to do includes ending and privatizing the National Flood Insurance Program, which could also be disastrous. And they also call for ending or reducing or weakening grant programs from both FEMA and HUD, which would harm the ability of the federal government to support both disaster recovery and preparation. So those are all things that hopefully there's the ability to push back on. And there's also some additional pieces that are not necessarily usually thought of as part of like disaster preparedness, but just general resilience. For example, the HUD and USDA, who support a lot of they provide financial assistance for a lot of the public housing construction that happens throughout the country. They adopted some requirements for updated energy code requirements for new housing construction, which would make those buildings more resilient and improve passive survivability in the case of disasters where there's power outages. We think that is likely to be reversed as well, although they haven't done it yet. So those are some of the risks that we're keeping an eye out under this administration.
Thank you, Sylvia. There were a set of questions that folks shared prior to the webinar that I'll just list off and give folks the option of responding. Pick whatever one you want. They include what happens or how will some of these changes, maybe Sarah, this is for you, impact communities where people feel safe because perhaps they live in a climate haven. I guess I'm thinking about Asheville, North Carolina, or see some of these other places, and the statistic that Amanda showed earlier about how many counties have actually been impacted by natural disasters. Another question was, what is the relationship to some of the attacks on environmental protection agency, environmental justice offices? Third question is about who will fund climate disasters going forward. I think the whole question of more of the burden falling on local governments poses an interesting question here. And there was another question related to trauma, disaster, and mental health, and how that is um, an aspect of the issue that isn't getting enough attention. So those are some questions. Um, we'll open up in case there are other questions that folks may have, but can you any of you on the line answer any of those questions that strike you?
I'll talk more on the I would say impact on local government and state government. So what's happening at the same time is like basically there's billions and billions of dollars that need to be invested in order to rebuild. The request from the federal government from the state is about $41 billion to be reinvested to support on these the rebuilding and the recovery in terms of these wildfires. But at the same time that the request for those resources are coming, there's also an attack on the very budget. For California, 33 to 36% of the budget comes from the federal government. So what I think it's really important just to understand sort of the just the pressure, economic pressure that's happening, given just the politics of the moment. And so what I think is important is that we understand that in many instances, if even local governments and state governments need to understand what resources are available in order to rebuild, how to organize itself and organize with community in order to make sure that those dollars come down at the local level, because these kind of disasters then also create a situation where, oh, we can't do this really important advancement or a policy advancement because we're now all focused in on the recovery and the rebuilding. I think going back to the what was shared from Organizing Resilience is how do these disasters actually help us organize our local governments, our state governments, so that all the good things that we knew we needed before the disaster can actually happen. So can we actually make this a moment where we can build green social housing? How can this be in a moment where affordability becomes a norm and is possible as we rebuild? How do we rebuild in a way that that our families can be protected? So I just think it's important that the organizing happen, because otherwise it becomes a situation in which, you know, what I would say one traumatic experience actually impacts and creates more trauma on the other end. So I would add that. The other thing that I wanted to speak to is on the trauma and mental health. And in many instances, as I was saying, many of the people who are coming to us, this is the first time they've even spoken to anybody about what happened. And that many times in applying for aid, it's the first time that people are just reliving their experience and the what and where they are now. And so I think it's also important to have support for the organizations around case management, connection to mental health, right there in the applications process and afterwards, because it is very difficult for many people to even open up and try to describe what their need is now. And that many times requires them to tell us, for example, what did you lose? And for people who not only they lost their home, they lost their cars, they lost their work tools. And as they're going through all of this, it just becomes a very, very difficult moment for them to withstand.
Now we're in the final stretch of this particular webinar. I'm going to check the chat to see if there are other questions. If there are questions, please flag it.
So there's sort of a question about, hoping for a crisis. I just really want to be clear. Stephen, I am not hoping for a crisis. My family lost its home in Superstorm Sandy. I live through floods and disasters all the time. I'm just accustomed to them. And so I am suggesting, I'm not hoping, I'm just suggesting that we think about what some crises points might be in the near future and that we not be flat-footed, because those will be potential opportunities to move forward a vision that is for our families and for the public good. And if we are not positioned to move that, someone else is going to come in and take people's stuff, which is what happens in communities after a disaster, right? People lose their jobs, their health, their homes, their equity, their community, their social capital. So that's, yeah. Okay, good. Steven's like, no, I know you didn't mean that. Great. I was like, but I'm not open, please, God. I don't like candles for a crisis. We got plenty of those. But that's the implication, is that there may be some opportunities in those moments, as much as we don't want them. So part of me has come to understand that, like, disaster organizing is being in constant relationship with grief. And I think that's kind of what's hard for us in this moment. There's just a lot of grief. I'm sure it's like, I think that's true in a lot of the communities we organize. And so just being able to be a little bit comfortable with that grief, and see places where we can move even as we are grieving.
And Amanda, maybe you can close this out. I thought the points you made about this is the time to organize, like defend our wins, center real people who are being impacted, and then prepare for those crises that we know are coming, so that when they hit, like, we're actually doing more than just getting back to normal, but we're trying to get back to something better. So I think the challenge there is figuring out scale and figuring out depth, because there's so much to do. But how do you think about that from your perch in New Jersey and with organizing resilience?
Yeah, I think, and this is going to sound oversimplified, but I really appreciate Angelica bringing in, like, the actual videos and voices of the community members that have connected with them and receiving help with them. I think that we cannot get desensitized to or be numb to the fact that, like, in many cases, without us or without connecting to each other, folks really would have lost it. I mean, people die in the disaster, and then people die shortly after the disaster from stress, from increased health issues, from increased substance use. Um, and so, to the extent that we are, like, constantly seeking out those people whose lives will be transformed as soon as we find and connect to them and connect them to each other, um, I know that sounds small, and I don't know how we get to scale, but I know if we keep our eyes on, like, on that piece, that we're going to get where we're going, and that the realities and lived experiences of everyday people through disaster and what we learn from that are going to be part of how we broadly move forward in the current climate.
Any other closing thoughts from our folks? And then, Taylor, I'll hand it back to you.
Amazing. Well, thank you all for sharing your insights and wonderful work that you're doing. Thank you to our attendees for being with us here today, for contributing in the chat, and we're really looking forward to sharing more resources with you all. I just dropped in the chat our post-event survey where you can let us know what you thought about today's event, what other events would be helpful in your work. I will also be sharing out the recording of the event, as well as all the links that were dropped in the chat today in a follow-up email, which you can expect by the end of this week. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week and look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.